Before we get into the meat, I just want to acknowledge the context in which we're having this conversation. We're in a stage of increasing global uncertainty, certainly politically, culturally, environmentally, and technologically. We have the rapid and dizzying information age, underscored by algorithms which tend to prioritize extreme emotions, points of view, and promise moral clarity in situations that aren't so black and white. There's also the echoes of the global pandemic that impacted not only our physical health, but our mental and social health. Many countries went into lockdown 5 years ago this month, and since then have not recovered the type of social contact that is fundamental to our well-being and our ability to tolerate differences. People are struggling to navigate uncertainty, conflict, and overwhelm. There's an increase in family and friend cutoffs and estrangements, a deep mistrust and anger toward the other side, as Zach was speaking about. Is it any wonder that we're in the midst of a loneliness epidemic? This is the place and the stage to talk about all of this, and as this year's theme is Braving New Conversations, we're going to have one. And we're going to start with you, Esther, because I know you're really curious about the experiences of the people in this room and how much this conversation is or is not coming up in their offices and in their lives. You had some questions you wanted to ask the audience.
So, can I just get a show of hands? First of all, good morning. How many of you have had conversations in this past year in your offices about polarization? Raise your hands. Thank you. We're going to do this a few times. About who you're voting for. If you believe in God, where you stand on abortion, where you stand on trans issues. Are you a Zionist? Anyone I'm forgetting?
You hit a lot of them.
Any more?
That's a lot.
A good list?
Would you add anything?
Loneliness. Loneliness. If you should cut off with your father or your mother or your brother or your friends.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, this to me, at first when I started to discuss this with Mary, I said, is this happening just in my office? I mean, it cannot be that, I've never been asked these questions. I thought that actually not to answer them was part of the virtue of being a therapist. Now it's the vice. And then I thought, I've been braving conversations in a way. I mean, what Zach was telling about. 20 years ago, I started talking about sexuality in a field called couples therapy that never mentioned sexuality. It's like very strange, but that's how it was. And then I wanted to brave the conversation about infidelity. Could we have a more complex conversation about relational betrayals? And then, this conference is the place where you often come to think out loud with colleagues and check new ideas and check kind of what is going on. Because it follows the trends of society. So for a while, we go into mindfulness, then we go into attachment, then we go into interiority, then we forget there is a world outside, and it's all the brain, the neuroscience, and then suddenly the world reappears. Politics, religion, class, poverty, fires, climate, all of that. This is where we are at. I'm listening to your description, I'm thinking, these people are going to leave depressed here this morning, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation. And I thought it's impossible to stand alone to talk about polarization. So that I thought we can do a different kind of keynote, and that's when I thought, who would be the best people for me and for all of us here to have a really thoughtful, thought-provoking, somewhat disturbing, start breathing now kind of conversation.
And naturally, Bill Doherty came to mind, and I had just had the pleasure of doing a little work with Monica. Monica came to mind for me instantly, and it's such an honor to have this group of people together. And these are incredibly busy people. I cannot believe we're all together right now. Bill, I want to start with you. In addition to your work as a marriage counselor and as a professor at the University of Minnesota, In 2016, you co-founded what is now the largest cross-partisan grassroots org combating polarization, Braver Angels.
That deserves an applause.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I should also say, Braver Angels, Monica holds the position of senior fellow there as well. Bill, how did you get into this work?
Well, first, I have to say that how pleased I am to be with both of you. And a lot of people don't know this about Esther. She is one of the most generous people with her sharing the spotlight. So I got to testify in Congress once because they invited Esther, and she said, no, I think Bill could do a better job.
The power of relationships.
So I'm just going to follow her.
I have to say, though, this is really important. A congressman calls me and says, I would like to talk with you because what we are experiencing here is that your partner had an affair with someone who wants to kill you. Because I couldn't understand why I would be called, and I was about to talk about infidelity. Then I said, I can talk with you about infidelity. I did spend 2 hours with him. But I think that you should at least have somebody who is, first of all, American and can really talk also about the political aspects of your betrayals. And I said, go to Bill.
I talk American.
Yeah, he does.
And I do not.
I have a combination of a Philadelphia accent and a Minnesota accent. It's perfect. It's perfect. So what was your question?
There was a question. How did you get into the work?
People often ask, what was the strategic plan behind starting Braver Angels? Well, here's what it is. I got a phone call one day from a colleague of mine, David Blankenhorn. He and I had done work around fatherhood issues, and so he lives in New York City. And he had been on the phone, with another colleague of ours, David Lapp, who also worked in fatherhood and things. And they were on the phone after the 2016 election. Do people remember that little election? And they were talking about how people were feeling in New York City. The world was ending. Mm-hmm. And in Southwest Ohio, mourning in America. And they decided on the spur of the moment to get 10 Hillary Clinton voters and 10 Donald Trump voters together for 13 hours over a weekend in December of 2016. I remember David Blankenhorn said all of the New York experts he talked to said, don't do it. The passions are too intense. So anyway, they called me, and I said, well, that's pretty brave. Mm-hmm. What were you thinking of doing with them? When you got them together. And they said they didn't know, but maybe they thought I could figure that part out. And I swear, I was hoping I was not free. I really was. I would have done it in a heartbeat, David. But anyway, I was free. And it's actually the first time I can remember in my life, I didn't serve in the military or anything, I felt a call for my country. Mm. I had never felt that before.
Yes.
Like, I know something as a therapist. I've done a lot of community engagement work and how to group facilitate. I have to do this. And so we had this amazing experience with people in South Lebanon, Ohio. We began just like we do in therapy. Why are you here? What do you want to get out of this? And what they said was they're tired of fighting each other. And we have children to raise here. We have schools and hospitals to build, and we can't do it if we're just fighting. It was an amazing experience. I thought it would be a one-off, like ask me what I did 2016 and pour me another Chardonnay, and I'll tell you the story. But they didn't want to stop, flew back, cashed in frequent flyer tickets, and we kept going. And so we're 5,000 workshops later and 15,000 members and Monica and the whole thing.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense why they called you. You've described the political right and left as a couple on the brink of divorce, but one that can't get divorced.
Yeah, the blues can't all move to Canada.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, we are stuck with each other. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are a divided couple, right. Not understanding each other. As some people longing for divorces interpersonally, but this is our country. And we have to figure out, as somebody in one of our
And
workshops...
even if we divorce, we may have to continue parent together.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
right. That's
exactly.
right.
So a young man, a conservative I read, said at the end of one of our workshops, he said, we're going to have to figure out how to run this country together, because what we're doing is every 2 or 4 years we get 51% or 49%.
Yeah.
Each group thinks it has a mandate, and then we pull them back. And so we have to figure out how to connect with each other.
What lessons from couples and family therapy apply to how we navigate these political and societal divisions?
Well, a big part of it is that with couples, the therapy takes off when both people look in the mirror.
And see themselves.
Yes.
And see themselves, right. As opposed to, it's your fault.
Yeah.
That's when the therapy takes off. When we see we have been doing this dance together, that we have co-created in some way, instead of, you're the fault, you change.
Right. And our politics is so much about us and them that the rhetoric, everything we hear is a model of it's them. They're the ones causing all the problems. So it's particularly difficult when it becomes this cultural, entrenched narrative.
Well, I want to say at the top about, cultural entrenched narratives. I want to say at the top that it's not an advocation, we're not advocating for like a kumbaya bridge building. And actually a lot of the language around bridge building has shifted just in the last couple of months. Could you say something about that? What you're observing with that language shift?
Who?
Yeah.
Monica, go for it, Monica.
The language around bridge building, I wonder what you're thinking.
If bridge building is still the right goal.
Oh, right. Yes. This particular election cycle, to me, felt like the one that raised the stakes the highest. On both sides, there's clips of the candidates and their surrogates saying some version of, if the other one wins, that's the end of our democracy. That's the end of our republic. And so I kind of crept up to the election going, well, the fears are turned up so high, and we know why. Fear is the cheapest emotion to generate, and it's the most mobilizing. We know that. Politics has been using fear forever. It's part of the playbook. Okay, but it's ramped up so high, only the losing side is going to have to deal with their fears after the election. So on the blue side, we're seeing discouragement, despair, a loss of faith in what felt like the purpose of engagement, to learn from each other, share perspectives. But it got so scary and the stakes feel so high that some people are just saying, I'm out. I gotta put more distance between us and them now. I feel so unsafe. Bridge building feels like a capitulation. It feels like I'm going to abandon my values. It feels like you want me to be nice instead of honest. I won't do it.
Esther, is this a dynamic you see in therapy?
I mean, I do think that couples therapists have a front seat on polarization. But the unique thing about polarization in couples is that it started with people who once couldn't stop talking to each other. They once actually liked each other. They once felt understood by the other. They once felt that the other's totally different style was complementary to them, etc. And then when they arrive, they are completely polarized. And one of the things that we learn is that, look, if you take I'm going to go away from politics for a moment. If you take just the multitude of conversations you can polarize on, should we have another child? Should we not? Should we move? Should we not? Should we, should we let them sleep? Should we let them cry? Should we, whatever the subject, the topic is not nearly as interesting as many relationship problems are complex problems, be it in the intimate, domestic, or in the public square. If these are complex issues, it means that they cannot be resolved with an either-or. The whole issue of complexity is that you have to deal with the polarity.
Right.
If you were alone debating, shall I have another child, shall I not have another child, you have to hold the part of you that is thinking about yes and the part of you that is thinking about no. What do we do in relationships? I'll pick one side that is convenient or comfortable for me, and I'll project onto you the other part of the equation that I don't want to deal with. I split the ambivalence. I make the complex simple because you become a yay and I become a nay on whatever the topic is. And now we can fight. When in fact, whoever says yes to another kid probably has a part somewhere in them wondering if so, then what? And whoever says no is probably also having some place a thought about what it would be like to, and the longing that accompanies that. But you erase the complexity, you project onto the other person the part of the story that you're loath to confront within yourself, within your party, within your color. And that's when you have polarization. You have completely disintegrated the interdependence.
Yes, and in politics, if I may, the cycle, the vicious cycle I think we're trapped in is we're judging each other more across the divide while we're engaging each other less. Now, I'm a journalist, and we believe in primary sources. You're judging each other more, you're engaging each other less. Repeat that cycle. What are those judgments based on?
My projections of you.
Exactly.
What I imagine you are, what I think that you stand for, which may have very little to do with who you really are.
So you spin away from reality. And our judgments of each other don't really get grounded in what they actually believe, but what we project that they believe. So I often say, whoever is underrepresented in your life is going to be overrepresented in your imagination.
Say that again.
Whoever is underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your imagination.
Write that down.
What are you going to do about it?
So it's interesting. We have going in the therapy direction, going in the political direction, and then last night you shared a stat with us about parents' judgment of their children, whether they would be okay. And I'd love for you to share that,
Yeah,
that chat.
it just occurred to me now, because who we think about could marry into our family is a sign for who the other is.
Right.
Okay? In 1960, only 5% of Americans said, there's polling on this, only 5% of Americans said they would be uncomfortable with their son or daughter marrying somebody of the other political party. Now it's up to 40 to 45%. The trends have gone the opposite way with religion. I like when I do community talks, I like to say, in the 70s, a Catholic married a Lutheran. Ooh. I mean, there's serious consideration of boycotting the wedding, okay? But now it's you married a Trump voter or a Hillary voter, somebody, a Harris voter. Religious, interracial, same thing. A high ambivalence about interracial marriage. Now that's down to about 6%.
Right.
So politics has become the new other, and our identities are much more about politics than they ever were. Than they used to be about religion, ethnicity. Politics is everything. So we're in the business of helping people with othering, and that's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah. I'm so curious. Do you have a lot of mixed marriages politically showing up in your offices?
Ooh, good question. There's a few hands.
It's 10%.
10%. That's very few hands. Wow. How about mixed parent-children political relationships? Okay, so let's talk about that. Monica, this next question is going to you. You're the author of the brilliant book, I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times, which is also full of great storytelling and practical strategies for building bridges. You're also the podcast of the Braver Angels show, A Braver Way, or I should say you are the guide across the divide, helping people to hear and be heard by people who confound them. Your work isn't just about ideas, it's deeply personal, as Zach alluded to earlier. What makes it personal for you?
I've always got my mom and dad. My mom and dad are on my shoulder right now as I sit here. We are Mexican immigrants. We became citizens in the year 2000, and immediately they went and got...
How come you have no accents?
That is such an Esther Perel question.
I'll tell you, the last word that I said with a Spanish accent in English was "three." And it was in about 3rd grade. And I remember having the thought, not long after that, that I was now saying 3, and that I missed it. It was like a sign of a distinction, and now you'd have to see my name with the accents on it to know. Anyway. It's a beautiful question.
There was a little jealousy in that question, maybe. I don't know. Just thinking.
The accent's good. Gosh, what was I saying now?
Your family.
Thanks a lot, Esther.
Jesus, Esther.
Your parents on your shoulders.
Thanks for getting us off track.
Esther just did a mini therapy session on stage with Monica.
We need some help up here with you guys.
We do. Fluidity.
Why is it personal for you? And how
Right,
yes.
thank you. So. We became
Shoulders.
citizens in the year 2000, and a Bush-Cheney sign just materialized over, like, the bulletin board over my mother's desk. And I was 17 at the time, and I was in high school. I hadn't thought that much about my politics, but I knew. I knew I was liberal, I was Democrat. I just knew. So, boy. Now, because we speak Spanish and we lived in New Hampshire, hardly anyone in the restaurants that we would often go to for dinner or what have you spoke Spanish. So I felt like we could speak at a higher volume than was polite because we were just background noise anyway. And we would argue. We would argue about what Glenn Beck said, what was going on CNN, Clinton's welfare policy, but after, all kinds of things. It was just non-stop. Now, around 2016, raise your hands if things got, the plot thickened. Yeah. The plot thickened for us, and the agony I felt around their politics and their political choice in that election was fierce. And they, also, I don't want to make it too me, like, they also were really confused about why I would be so mad and all of this. So we had lots of conversations, and they were so heated, but somehow we didn't burn. We didn't burn our relationships so much that you couldn't repair. It's almost like we kept it at a simmer, to use the kitchen analogy. We kept it at a simmer. And I got to the point, and I remember I wrote this line in the book, and then I erased it, and then I wrote it in the book, and then I erased it, and then I just wrote it in the book. We got to the point where I realized that if I were my parents, I would have voted for Trump too.
I would love to bring them into the room. And Monica did a very brave thing, which is on brand for Braver Angels. She interviewed her parents for their podcast episode about this political divide. And we have a clip, and I'd love to play it, if we could tee that up.
What's been hard about having big political disagreements in our family? What have been the challenges for you and the toughest moments?
I always felt like I was a little afraid that those disagreements could break our relationship. So I probably tried not to be too adamant about trying to make my point. But like, you might remember that time when I asked you if we were ever going to be prevented from seeing our grandkids, because I heard some stories that people were having that situation in their families, and I didn't want any of that to happen. So
that was the first time I realized that you really were afraid of that when you said that. It surprised me to hear it. I'm like, oh, he really does worry.
Yeah.
The hardest thing for me, it was to give up on trying to convince you, because it goes against. I have a very strong sense of doing the right thing. I always worry, and even though I'm a Republican and there's a preconception, I worry about others, and
you do.
And
yeah,
for
you really
me, for me to say, okay, I'm not going to try to convince her anymore, that was a huge step for me.
For me, one of the hard things, especially in the beginning of the Trump campaign and after he'd won the first election, I live in Seattle. A lot of my friends are liberal, but there were a lot of people who spoke as if you're a bad person if you have someone who supports Trump in your life and you're not always trying to change them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's funny because I never questioned my love for you guys, like never, ever, ever. But I did question if I was a bad person for not trying harder to change you.
Exactly.
I did question that.
Exactly.
And that was hard. And I also remember there was one moment, we've talked about seeing this movie called Bowling for Columbine, where it was all four of us in the car, and you two were in the front seat, and me and my brother were in the back seat, and me and my brother came out from this Michael Moore documentary that as I look back on it, was pretty anti-Republican. But at the time, me and my brother saw it as like, what we saw it doing was making a really compelling case about a bunch of issues we cared deeply about. But I remember coming out of that going, wow, what a masterwork, and just assuming that the two of you would have seen it exactly the same way I did. And then when I brought up to you, like, wow, wasn't this great? Like, do you see that? Like, how cool that is? And you guys were like, not at all. That was garbage. What are you even talking about? And the rage that I felt that you weren't seeing something that was so obvious to me. That for me, because you guys know I'm fire. I am kind of fire. And the fire comes out when I think you guys aren't seeing something that is so obvious to me. And that plays out a lot, where that's a hard thing for me. That's a hard thing.
So on one end, we see repair as possible, but it's a strategic endeavor. And on the other end of the spectrum, we see a huge increase in cutoffs, particularly among friends and family, a lot of estrangements. We see it happening with younger generations, but it's really become an intergenerational situation. And I think, as a journalist myself, I know it's not just coming up in therapy. There was a big New Yorker piece about it, what's going on with the rise of going no contact. On TikTok, there's community groups that help people break away from their families, and obviously there are many situations in which it's necessary. But as you were saying last night, in either case, it's a tragedy. Esther, what do you think is causing this shift, this paradigm shift? What are the sort of meta pieces to this?
So I think that there are a few fundamental changes taking place in the world of relationships. First of all, for most of history, in our areas, relationships used to be tight knots. Now they are loose threads. You couldn't get out of it. You couldn't get out of your family. You couldn't get out of your marriage. You married once. It was for life. If you didn't like it, you could hope for an early death of your partner. Tight knots.
Yeah.
Preferably your spouse dying.
Of your partner. Yes. Of their death. And we have shifted from structure to networks. That's what we call the liquid life. That's the first thing that has happened. For most of history, and still in many other parts of the world, relationships were organized around duty and obligation, around loyalty and community. You got a lot of clarity, you got very little freedom and very little personal expression. We shifted from duty and obligation to choice and options. We have more freedom than we've ever had when it comes to relationships. At the center of relationships today is an individual in search of community, ruled less by values sometimes and more by feelings, primarily the feeling of authenticity. Authenticity stands for being true to myself, and in the name of being true to myself, I may need to forego relationships that demand a compromise of myself that would not be true. You follow? And then from there, we have never been more free, but we also have never been more alone. And part of the aloneness comes with the freedom, because the burdens of the self have never been heavier. I have to make all the decisions myself with authenticity. How do I know? So we are crippled with uncertainty and crippled with self-doubt. And then lastly is a very interesting thing that I saw your reaction when I said this to you yesterday. On the one hand, we have a fluidity around redefining what is a family, What is a couple? How do we define the circle of care? What are the boundaries in relationships, etc.? We believe that there is a possibility to divorce, there is a possibility to defer, there is a possibility to call family things that are very new relational configurations. And we talk about family of choice very comfortably. And at the same time, we have never had more focus on intergenerational trauma. Here is the roots and the biology that you cannot undo, and here is the fluidity of everything you can create, and here are all the cuts that need to happen in order for that to happen. And when we talk about intergenerational trauma, it's our new version of talking about the families you don't leave.
Right. And if it's in the air, it's in the water, it's in the culture. The song that we heard before we came on stage is a Miley Cyrus song called Flowers. And if you hear some of the lyrics in the context of what you just said, I realized I can buy myself flowers. I can talk to myself for hours. I can say things you don't understand. I don't need you. I'm enough by myself. And look how glorious, I'm a celebrity singing about this. I can talk to myself for hours. I can be in my silos where I'm comfortable with people who think like me, and I don't need you.
It's going even further, because you can be alone at home. You don't have to leave your home to work, or to eat, or to shop, or to date, any of it. You can stay,
I order my flowers on 1-800-Flowers, and it'll show up to my door. I don't even have to go over to the shop.
So I think that you cannot talk about the cutoffs without talking about the social atrophy. This is, I think, the biggest piece that is happening. On the one hand, you have more freedom to negotiate aspects of relationship than you've ever had. On the other hand, you have lost the skills necessary for the negotiation. What are those skills? The ability to tolerate ambiguity, uncertainty, experimentation, the unknown, surprise. And why do we lose these? Because we are ruled by predictive technologies that are promising to remove us from all the inconveniences of life. Every obstacle removed, every inconvenience.
All the messy interactions we'd rather not have.
Frictionless life. And conflict is friction. By the way, so is sex.
Yeah.
So,
good friction.
Two things.
Esther, talk about friction.
Talk about friction.
How do you like that for a setup?
No, I mean, it's very interesting. I had a conversation with Trevor Noah this week, and we talked about friction and obstacles. And he says to me, you need obstacles. Every story with obstacles, every experience with obstacles becomes the story you tell. If there is no obstacle, there's not really a story. And I thought about that afterwards. Friction, it's me coming, when you were talking about your parents, we used to have Friday night Shabbat dinners, and we would have the most screaming matches around the Middle East. Screaming matches. You don't go back to Russia, I mean, the whole bit, And then, in the middle of this, how can you think this way? I was like 16, 17, exactly. Somebody would say, the cheesecake is delicious. This is what I'm aspiring to in a funny way. Like, that's friction,
And so I think, so we'll talk about our field now, because I think we're part of this culture, right? I think we are more influenced by it than we influence it, frankly. And so
say that again.
I think we are more influenced by the mainstream culture than we influence it, okay? And part of my wish in life is that we were more influential, okay?
Without being an influencer.
Well, if there's enough money in it, we could have another conversation there. I'm going to be a venture capitalist. I just learned that. That's where the action is going. Anyway, where was I?
Well,
can you help?
Turn.
Yeah. So we can be in the business of telling people don't have friction. You should feel comfortable. This is why I'm comfortable with myself. Yeah. And then what we can do around the politics is to say, why are you still relating to your cousin who is voting for a democracy destroyer? Okay? And so we can then, in terms of the political stuff, it's one more opportunity to cut off instead of dealing with the friction.
Yeah, there's a sticker at a coffee shop, I was telling you about this, that I saw some months ago. You know how they have stacks of stickers people slap on their laptops or water bottles, you know, largely Gen Z. And there's a thick stack of them, and the sticker said, "May the bridges I burn light my way."
Wow. See, a lot of people liked it.
This is what we're talking about.
Yeah, there's definitely
two different ways to think about it.
May the bridges, I'll tell you my reaction,
Yeah.
terror. My reaction was terror. Because there's a French philosopher who has this quote that I love, and it's that when we come together across different views, we rub and polish our brains against each other. We sharpen our thinking. You know, I often say when we're divided, we're so divided we're blinded, but it's not just blindness toward what the other side really thinks and who they are and their motives and whatnot. It's blindness to yourself and to your own views. When you are never confronted with your own opinion, how do you know it's yours, first of all? How do you know you're not just going along? And secondly, how can you make sure that your arguments are strong and that you wouldn't be shifting or finding nuance? It's a terrifying prospect to burn bridges thinking that we're making ourselves stronger in every case.
Very well said, and great quote. If someone wrote that down, share it with us. So many surprising things in this conversation. We've had a Miley Cyrus mic drop. Sex and cheesecake.
Yes.
What about me?
What about you?
I noticed they got... No,
yes. We're coming to you right now.
I'm good.
What did he say?
I didn't catch that last part.
It's so funny. Before I actually, a quick relational note. Before we came out on stage and last night, and when we spoke, you know, in advance, Bill said, if I say things once, if I say things 2, 3 times, cut me off after the 3rd time I repeat myself. And we're sitting next to each other so we can grab each other to...
That was confidential, by the way.
Not a therapist. Not a therapist.
There you go. We get away with it.
There we go. Yeah. Okay, but bringing it back to, I want to kind of ground us in some of those practical pieces, because we're in this great sort of conceptual space, and I'd love to bring it to you, Bill.
Thank you.
Of course. What do we lose when we lose the capacity to stay in relationship with the people we struggle with? And how do you work with people on a practical level to navigate that?
Well, I'd like to take it, if it's okay, I'd like to take it to the level of the political polarization.
Yes, please.
Because when people say now, and I get it, there's a part of me that feels like giving up some days.
Yes.
I mean, let me just say, we're under a grave threat, in my opinion, right? A grave threat. And so it's a challenge for any of us who are in the bridge, certainly for me, in the bridge building. And so when I'm really confronted with this question of why keep trying, it's because I believe if we stop the conversation, the only options are coercion and violence. We have to keep the conversation going. And let me say, I'm not talking about the conversation with certain political leaders who don't want to talk. I'm talking about the conversation with each other. Because they will go on, they will leave at some point the stage, but we will go on. And so for me, it's this, how do we hang in there without, I want to go back to what Monica said in the podcast, without trying to change the other, defining myself. This is differentiation. We need a little return to differentiation of self, because right now we're having a profound challenge to self-regulation in the midst of political differences. Profound challenge. And so how do I hold on to and articulate my values and beliefs and not be emotionally dysregulated because somebody close to me thinks differently?
It's that feeling, until you change, I am not okay.
I cannot be okay until you change.
Which
This is what
is
happens
a
in couples
shift
therapy.
on the other side of differentiation is fusion.
Say again?
Fusion?
On the other side of differentiation is fusion.
Yes.
Fusion is when I cannot hold on to myself in the presence of you thinking or feeling differently from me.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Which brings us to what I think, though I am a little biased, one of the best Esther Perel quotes. Relational dilemmas are not problems to solve, but paradoxes to manage.
Say it again.
You got it, Bill.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah.
It's worth saying again.
No, I meant you got it.
Oh, yeah.
Relational dilemmas are not problems to solve, but paradoxes to manage. And that idea is freeing for a lot of people because it releases the pressure of having to solve the problem. And Esther, I know you see this all the time in your office, but also separately for the one-time anonymous sessions for the podcast. And we have a clip from the podcast as well that I think demonstrates this, if you'd like to play it.
A minute ago, you mentioned just this idea of showing up for one another, and my dad is the first person I would call if my car broke down or if I, were in some sort of bind, because I know that he would get on a plane and be here and
in that moment, none of his different belief systems, values, views about my sexuality would have the slightest importance. And this is actually really beautiful in a family, is that people grow up and become different, have different values, different lifestyle, different sexual orientations, in which sometimes the other people may or may not be cheerleaders of that part. No, they may not go with you to Pride. But they'll fly from wherever they are at without having to ask twice. And you see this as a problem, and I understand how you see it as a problem, but I also see it as actually a strength of your family.
Tell us about what's happening in this clip.
I mean, this is in the context of a number of sessions that people applying for where should we begin the podcast. And I would like to come and discuss, shall I break up with my friend, my father, my mother, my brother? And I thought, I really want to understand cutoffs, because cutoffs, when I learned, when we were studying Bohemian family therapy, cutoffs was the plight of the people who cannot differentiate. Cutoffs happen to people who can't tolerate difference.
Oh, wow.
So they cut off, because how can you have, and this is before we discussed it in the political context, it was just purely families, brothers who don't talk to each other for 30 years and things like that. And I understood from a cultural point of view that she thinks this is problematic. And I thought this is actually resilient. And I have been in more than one session where this has become something that I find myself saying. The parents are voting differently, they're not particularly pro-queer, and that's an understatement. But the same father who makes all these proclamations, is the first person she will turn to for anything. To which I say, ideology is very, very important, but also is people's behavior and actions. And sometimes we are not necessarily that consistent. We think a certain way about things, but then there is the person we like and we know, and for you, it doesn't matter who you voted for or what you stand for. And there is a finding of that has always been interesting for me, is that I studied for a while people who hid Jewish children during World War II. And who were these altruistic personalities, so to speak? Who are the people who stick out their neck and are willing to die, basically, for saving? And often these people were no less anti-Semitic than any other person. They just saw a hungry child at their door, and the value of not letting a child be hungry was more important than their dislike and contempt for the Jew. And this, I'm giving it in the Jewish context, but I think this can be applied to any other minority. And it stayed with me. I learned this long time ago. It stayed with me that what you do in that particular moment, their religious values were suddenly stronger than their political values. So The thing that accompanied this clip for me was I did a conversation last week that was that because actually before we said, how are you all breathing?
Breathing?
Yeah, like, are you, it's okay? Because, Bill, you said we need to check on them, you know.
Yeah.
Make
You
sure
Break into small groups now.
Yes.
For a while.
Actually, Esther, before you go into that piece, I want to push a little bit, because I imagine there's quite a few people in the room who may be thinking, okay, well, there are situations where people have to cut off.
Of course, of course.
And it's extremely complicated. It's very nuanced. It's often very sad. And I know it must be so challenging to guide a client.
But you know
in
the
this
interesting
situation.
thing? It's a little bit like the person who sits in your office and can't think about themselves and is worried of being selfish. The person who you think probably it would do them good to cut a bit is usually the one who holds on the most. It's not so consistent that the people who come to tell you about their cutoffs are those dire situations where you say, you need protection, you need a space, you need boundaries. It's the ones that are just simply saying, I can't be with these people who think like that. And if it was the people in dire situations saying, I'm thinking about a break, but those are not the ones. Those are the ones where you say to the patient, have you considered not returning the phone call?
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I want to pivot a little bit because, you know, a huge part of what we're talking about is what it actually means to engage with people who have fundamentally different beliefs, values, and Monica, you put yourself in this situation literally all the time. Your work, all the time. You interview and find common ground with people whose beliefs dramatically are different from your own, and I know you lead with curiosity. A recent-ish conversation included one you had with conservative media host Glenn Beck. And I'm going to read the way that Glenn introduced Monica, because I think it's pretty notable. A lot of people talk about bridging divides, but actually doing it is different. Journalists are some of the worst offenders. They whine about political division while contributing to it. But today's guest is different. She leads with curiosity. The conversation is great, and I recommend people check it out. What was so striking, though, were the comments on the video, mostly from conservatives, but also from liberals, people in the middle, saying, I just sent this to 8 different people, or I wish there were more conversations like this. Why are we not having more conversations like this? And there's such a sense of longing to connect with people who have a difference of opinion and they just don't know how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember right before recording that conversation, how afraid I was, sort of despite all the work I've done and this book I wrote and everything, I was still just sitting there going, what did I say yes to? And I allowed myself to look at my fears. Glenn Beck is going to attack me. He does not respect me. He is going to use this to score points, as so many in media do. The folks on the left, on my side, are going to see me in this episode, and they are going to judge me and come after me because I did not defend our side enough. I had all these reasons building up, these fears, that basically added up to, don't lead with curiosity at all. Come in on guard. Come in on guard because you are not safe. You know, you have a sense of belonging, you have a sense of identity, you need to protect that because this is a dangerous situation. So I looked at all those fears and then I tried to be still and I tried to come into what I know, which is Glenn Beck is a human being, you're a human being, he invited you to this conversation, he knows about your book. What if you come in modeling precisely the kinds of interactions you wish there could be more of in the world? What does that take? It takes vulnerability. It takes letting go of the fear. And I gotta tell you, it was mind-blowingly cool, that conversation.
But say what he said when you came in. The thing, the little...
Yes. So I was, despite my, meditative Zen, self-affirmation or whatever, I still like, okay, we're on, and Glenn is in, and he's in his giant studio, and I'm kind of in a hotel room, beaming in virtually, and I'm seeing his team mic him up and everything, and we're not hitting record yet. And then he turns to me and he says, "Hi, Monica." And the first thing he says, "So apparently you and I have a connection. We're both from the Seattle area. I'm from up in Everett, Washington. That's really close to you, right? Great area." And I was like, this guy, who, by the way, my parents worship Glenn Beck. They agree. This guy who I disagree with so much, he chose to make the first thing he told me on what he knew would be a tense conversation, a point of common ground.
It's the 80-20 rule.
What's that?
It's the 80% of things that you agree on,
Yeah.
and the 20% of things that you don't agree on, but you leave the extreme on the out.
Yes.
You don't include the extremists in the conversation, no matter what the subject is. Yes. And then you focus first on the 80%, one aspect of the 80%.
Yes. That's
Bill, is that what you do?
Yeah, well, and I'd like to follow up, because one of Monica's great kind of lessons is to ask somebody, how did you come to your belief?
Yes.
Not what do you believe or why do you believe it. The how invites the story. So I want to connect it to the skills we have as therapists. We elicit people's stories. We know how to get on their wavelength with their stories. So little things like, how did you come to believe this? One of the Braver Angels sort of core principles is, behind every passionate political belief, there's a story.
Yes.
People don't come to it just, out of intellectual curiosity. There's a story.
Yes.
So I want to tell a story about workshops we've done with elected officials, state legislators. We've even done a few in Congress. If you want to feel a little hopeful, Google the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress. These are Democrats and Republicans who have lunch together every week. And then talk about how they might do bipartisan. But one of the questions we ask these legislators when we get them together is, what life experiences have influenced your values and beliefs about public policy and public service? What life experiences have influenced your values and beliefs about public policy and public service? Everybody gets 5 uninterrupted minutes to tell their story. Every time I've done this, there are tears in the room. There is a heart connection. I just want to briefly tell, this was from a New England state, and a Democrats, the pandemic was ending. I walked into the room. The Democrats were sitting on one end of the room with masks. Republicans were sitting the other end of the room without masks. And they were so far apart we had to use a microphone for introductions.
My God.
We got them into small groups. So I'm saying, as therapists, we know how to design spaces and conversations. We know how to do this. Small groups, okay, and everybody took their mask off. And then the question, everybody had that question. And I remember there was a Democrat sitting over here, and he said, I grew up in the foster care system. He said his mother suffered, his father abandoned the family, his mother suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He and his siblings bounced around the foster care system, and that was part of what drove him into public service, public life, to make a difference for these kids. He no sooner finished than a Republican sitting on this side, the guy who brought the Trump campaign to that state, said, oh my God, I don't believe this. I grew up in the foster care system. He told his story. He doesn't trust government intervention, so he went into the faith community, the voluntary sector. He got into job training. They had very different policies to approach something that was a common human experience.
Exactly.
And that's what we've learned. If you start too abstract and you don't ask how, and ask for the stories and listen to the stories, that's where we start to make a connection. We know how to do that.
Yeah, you do.
Mm.
You do. That's right.
So well said. And yes, more therapy for politicians. And for everyone. That brings us to our last sort of chapter in this conversation, and you've already brought us there, Bill, which is really, what is the role of therapists today? What is the role of therapists today? Okay.
That's a passing on? What was that?
What do you,
I don't know.
Bill, you start.
Well, you just said I just said
Here,
it.
you know what?
Okay.
I'm gonna start as again non-therapist. Esther and I are working on a conference called Sessions Live. It'll be at the end of April, and we've been grappling with this question: what is the role of therapists today? In the context of this conversation, and as a non-therapist myself, I see the role of therapists today as our navigators in uncharted waters. I mean, we need help, and people are bringing these issues into offices, and they're looking to all of you for your guidance and for you to be a person who has answers for things that have no simple answers.
They can look for people who have answers, but we don't have answers. We will help them sit with complexity. We will help them breathe through ambiguity and nuance. So I will tell the story of this. So this was for me a moment when I thought, oh, here is the role of a therapist, you know. So we're at South by Southwest, and I basically begin a conversation with two futurists. One we are on a triple blind date. None of us have ever met. We don't know each other. It's been arranged in 18 hours because my original guest had to cancel. So I'm going in and I'm thinking, okay, we're going to have a conversation about the future, which means a conversation about the unknown and uncertainty. And one of them is a predictor. She does predictions. And the other one calls himself a non-futurist. He actually talks about our imagination. So he goes into the opposite of creativity, of anxiety is creativity. And you can imagine, and then you can be nice to other people. And the premise is totally individualistic. If you're good with yourself, etc., then you will be good with humanity. So she, at one point, listens to him and she goes, Alain. And nobody sees it. And I look at her and I say, what just happened? How did you hear what he just said? And she says, I disagree with everything he just said. And the room goes in contraction mode. Every stress level goes up. The tension, because people are no longer, if you don't have friction, if we don't teach people to tolerate friction, then you are stumped. The moment you have frustration, difference, conflict, you can't handle it. So when the room got into a total state of stress, which I said, how many of you have felt stress levels go up the whole room? None of them therapists. And then I said, welcome to couples therapy. And everybody laughed. And then I said, they both care about the same thing, mind you. They actually do both care about the same thing. And you can't just address the future with prediction, and neither can you just address it with your imagination. It is an interdependent part. Therefore, it's complementary. Let's not polarize. And I think that a lot of our role is helping people to sit with that kind of ambiguity. An app tells you without any ambiguity where to go, what to listen to, what to eat, who to date, etc. It doesn't leave you time to deal with uncertainty, with the unknown, with making bad choices, with dealing with the consequences of your bad choices. So we're getting more and less able to deal with the paradox. Complex problems do not have simple solutions. They are all about managing the polarity.
Right. And as you say it's not solving the problem, but managing the paradox. So on that stage, the audience might have felt like, this can't stand. They don't like each other. They don't agree with each other. That can't stand. This has to be solved one way or the other. But
that's right.
You're managing the paradox because the paradox, it's actually a healthy tension. And it is my belief there's a healthy tension in the political polarity of the United States of America. There's a healthy tension in the fact that liberals and conservatives sort of seem to appear as if by magic in every country. And there seems to be this kind of pendulum swing. How can we manage that paradox? And another thing I thought of as you were talking, with Glenn Beck, probably my deepest terror comes from this belief that engagement is endorsement. That was my deepest terror. In fact, after I went on the show, I was like, I can't share this on social media. I can't share this on social media. I'll be destroyed. But engagement is not endorsement. And those two futurists engaging with each other do not have to agree. And the audience is made better off witnessing the tension so that they can sharpen their brains, see things being challenged, and come to something stronger. So you played the great role of a therapist, just presenting that as a reality.
I would love to add a thing that you just made me think about. I was asked in a conversation, why is it that every authoritarian regime that rises starts by dismantling sexual freedom? Whether it's Putin, Orban, you name it. You know, because, and this is a piece for the therapists, because sexuality is one of our fundamental areas of freedom and sovereignty. Therefore, you go and you attack the individual freedom first. You deal with it by doing anti-queer, by dismantling the gender studies department, by dealing with trans issues. I mean, every government, really, you can track, there's 26 of them in Europe alone, that you can follow how you take a piece that we know very, very well. So we don't have to be, because I am not qualified in politics, but I am qualified in understanding how certain regimes deal with the individual, and specifically with a part of the individual that we know a lot about, which is sexuality, relationships, family ties, friendships. Our job is to help people not sever them because they don't know what else to do, then listen to you and be so wondering, well, how do I do that?
Yeah.
I mean, did I really need to lose my best friend? You know, be it over the vaccine, be it over Zionism and Gaza, be it over the political election in this country or any of the other countries. This is really the fragmentation. So what is one of the things we're working against at this moment is fragmentation.
So on that note, Bill, I'd love to end with you. And also I want to say Bill is doing a phenomenal workshop later as well.
Well, we'll see whether it's phenomenal, but thank you. That's to be determined.
Well, I saw a title and description, and I think it's phenomenal.
It's a great title.
I'd love to end with you. You've brought a quote. This is actually a quote that ends all of your emails.
Yeah, I have it on my signature, but I'd like to do a brief quote before that from a political leader, a member of Congress, conservative from a Western state, who attended one of our workshops and told his story about growing up in poverty and about his mother saying, take him to the State House and said, you could do this someday, okay? And then somebody else told the story of losing family members in the Holocaust, and that's what drove her into political life. So he was part of this. And when I asked people at the end, what are you taking with you from this experience? He said, what I'm taking with me is you can't fight somebody in the same way when you know their heart. You can't fight somebody in the same way when you know their heart.
100%.
So I'm going to end with something from Abraham Lincoln. And I've been thinking about this when you talk because it's about it's a new time and we have to think anew. And we've been trying to stimulate this here today. So this is Abraham Lincoln, 1862, address to Congress. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Esther, Monica, Bill. Thank you all
Thank you.
For being with us in this conversation.
Thank you.